Okay, welcome back to members of 121 Community Church in Grapevine, Texas, and our ongoing study in Paul and the Faithfulness of God by N.T. Wright. We're going to take a look at the one page in the entire Paul project by Professor Wright. We're going to take a look at page 1163, and it gives us a picture of the chiastic structure of Romans 9, 10, and 11. And we want to take a look at that in this special lesson. And if you'll notice, I prefer to call it the chiastic pyramid. But the root word chiasmos is translated junction. So a chiastic structure is basically two separate structural entities that face each other and reflect off each other from a pivot point or a junction point, which is in the center of the narrative. And Professor Wright tells us that that junction, that apex point, is going to be Romans 10, 9, and 10. It's block 5 in the chart. And that is the covenant renewal means to confess Jesus Christ as Lord and to confess Jesus Christ as risen from the dead. And that confession of the believer is the pivot point for the two structural entities that will face each other and reflect off each other. And in a chiastic model, it's a reflection through levels of themes. It's thematic levels of meaning. And in this model, we're going to pass through three themes. We're going to be looking at perceiving, vocation, sovereignty, and divine wisdom. But in a chiastic model, which again translates as junction, a junction where reflection takes place, you must begin at that pivot point. So you don't go to block 1 right away. You go to block 5, you understand what the pivot point is going to be, and then you go to block 1. I've already discussed block 5. That's the confession of the believer that Jesus Christ is Lord. Now we go to block 1. We begin with the fact that God chose Israel as his elect, and he entrusted them with the oracles of God. God's oracles of truth were entrusted to Israel, and they were to take the word of the living God and become a light to the nations. That was their commissioned vocation. And block 2, and fundamentally behind this covenant election of Israel, is the starting point of recognizing that Yahweh is sovereign over all of creation. Yahweh is sovereign over all of new creation, and that creation was created through Jesus Christ, and new creation will come through Jesus Christ. God is sovereign over all creation. But then we get into a little bit of trouble because we get into the theme of vocation. Block 3, Israel turned inward instead of outward. They did not become the light to the nations. They turned possessive and inward and shunned all others as unclean. They did not become a light to the nations. They stumbled in their vocation. And therefore, if you look at block 4, when Christ the Messiah arrived as the fulfillment of the Torah, Israel did not recognize Christ because the Israelites had hardened hearts, and they did not have a fleshy heart that could receive the word of Christ. If you remember, Jesus in the temple was speaking to the Sanhedrin. He says, "You can't hear me because my Father has not drawn you to me." Their hearts were hardened. They could not hear and recognize the messianic word. That takes us to our 5th block, that pivot point. I call it a hinge because by calling it a hinge, it speaks of a doorway. It's a hinge of a doorway for me because we're swinging from the internal model in that left column of Sophia, wisdom of the heart, and Gnosis, wisdom of the new mind. And then we're crossing the threshold at the pivot point to enter into the realm of positing and the realm of praxis, where we present and minister with our model of God's kingdom in the concrete, actual world. So if we go to block 6, we're back into that theme of perceiving again, and we see that through the word or the rhema voice of Christ, the gospel is made manifest to the nations as light. And as you remember here, remember in the Gospel of John, remember the sermon that Jesus preached in Capernaum in the synagogue, where he said, I am the living bread come down from heaven. And remember, hundreds and hundreds of followers turned away and deserted Jesus. And remember, he turned to the disciples, to the 12, and he said, are you going to leave me too? And remember what Simon Peter said. He says, we will not leave because you have the Rhemata Zoe. You have the Rhemata Zoe. He used Rhema in this block 6 here, and that means that's the voice of the Logos. That's the voice of the eternal Logos. So basically, Simon Peter said, Lord, you are the living word from God. You are the Rhemata Zoe. And so, perceiving comes through the word that is borne forward by Jesus Christ. And then we move into that vocation theme in block 7. Because Israel had stumbled at their vocation, God opened himself up to the Gentiles through Jesus Christ as the true messianic messenger of salvation. And then we lead into block 8, where actually God had set aside Israel momentarily in order to inaugurate a ministry to the Gentiles through the apostolic commissioning of Paul. So yes, Israel is set aside momentarily, but there is the hope and the promise that they can be grafted back in if they genuinely take on that heart of flesh, receive the word of Christ in love and compassion and in true faith. They can be grafted back in. So yes, they are set aside momentarily. Mission is opened up to the Gentiles. And we move to block 9, and we look at the wisdom of God is the crimson thread that runs through all of soteriology for Paul and all of creation for Paul. The wisdom of God has entered into Jerusalem in the person of Jesus Christ. He is the way and the what? The truth. He is the truth. He is the wisdom of God in person, in the flesh. He is the wisdom of God. And that is the same wisdom that had been commissioned to Israel in the beginning, that they failed with their vocation. But if they do turn unto the Lord with a heart of flesh and receive the word of Christ, we have a 10th step that says that there can be a return moment where Israel can be grafted back in. Israel can be grafted back in. So we do have kind of a loop here. It does loop back to the, we always get returned back into the self. The self can revise the self's sign model through which they view the world and through which they minister in concrete praxis. But fundamentally, a chiastic structure is a structure that is a structure unfolding levels of thematic truth. We have 4 levels of themes here: perceiving, vocation, sovereignty, and divine wisdom. But the first half of that narrative is on the left. You've got, it's a single narrative from chapters 9 through chapter 11. So Professor Wright is telling us that it's Romans 9 through 11 to give us a singular narrative in chiastic structure. I like to make it a chiastic pyramid. That's the way I like it. So this is a chiastic pyramid. It reflects Romans 9 through 11. It gives you, well, Professor Wright blessed us by giving us all of the references. I love it. If you look at block 1, let's begin there. You got 9, 1 through 5, then you go 9, 6 to 29, 9, 30 to 33, 10, 1 to 4, and then 10, 9 and 10. And then back down to 10, 14 to 17, 10, 18 to 21, 11, 1 to 32, and 11, 33 to 36. A singular narrative that forms the chiastic pyramid of thematic reflection. Two structures face each other and reflect off and interpenetrate each other, and we get this picture of a chiastic pyramid, but it all pivots at that junction. Chiasmos, literally, good. In a literal translation of chiasmos, it is translated junction or apex. Some translate it as apex. It's apex. It's junction. I call it hinge. I've known others that have used that as a translation. So I use a chiastic structuring as pivoting on a hinge or swinging on a hinge, which hinges a mirror, because we're dealing with themes that are reflected against each other. And so we end up with a great structural help here from Professor Wright that gives us a picture of really Paul's understanding of covenant and how it is always understood with a backdrop of a singular covenant narrative. And that covenant narrative is fully explicated in Romans 9 through 11, says Professor Wright. But he reminds us in the book that you start with block 5, not block 1. You start with the high Christology that Paul held. You start with Christology. You start with the confession of Christ as Lord. You start with the confession of the 3 apocalyptic signs of cross, resurrection, and spirit. Remember, we've already had the lessons where Professor Wright told us that Paul held 3 apocalyptic signs. He added a 4th, but it was cross, resurrection, and spirit. Then he added the 4th of new creation. Then he added the 4th apocalyptic marker of new creation. So we had cross, resurrection, spirit, and new creation. And that helps us to shape up our chiastic model of a picture of God's kingdom, a picture of the kingdom of Christ. And we wear that picture as a filter or as spectacles through which we view the concrete external world. And at times we may need to adjust that focus of our sign model, of our chiastic model that we hold in our motivational base and in our new mind, because it is Sophia wisdom that gets corrected in the heart of conviction, but it's also the gnosis of new mind. So every time we revise our sign model, our chiastic model, sign model of the kingdom, it will affect motivational base with Sophia wisdom, and it will affect gnosis in the new mind wisdom. Both areas get affected. And that in turn empowers and directs our praxis in concrete reality. So it becomes a true dialectic that is circular, but, and this is a circle really, but I've got it drawn here in the chart as a pyramid. And so on one page, and thankfully Professor Wright did all the hard work. He gave us all these references already broken down. And so all you have to do is, well, I say all you have to do. Actually, it takes quite a bit of work, but you don't just read this book. You have to have your Bible open. You have to have your lexicon, your Greek lexicon open and ready. You have to be ready to engage in true exegesis and study of the scriptures in order to fully understand what Professor Wright is teaching here, which is very apparent after you get into the study of it for yourself and dig into the scriptures. It really does make sense. It does come down to this 4 levels of themes: perceiving, vocation, sovereignty, and divine wisdom. So it gives us I just did this as kind of an extra lesson for pages 1150 to 1170. This is drawn up for us on page 1163. It falls within that 20-page section, but the whole 20 pages deal with chiastic structure for the kingdom of Christ. So it's a fairly short, about 15 minutes here. We'll wrap it up at 15 minutes. But this will give you a little bit of an actual graphic picture of the covenant narrative for new creation that Paul posited in Romans 9, 10, and 11.